This is the 40 Thrive Podcast, episode 16.
You're listening to the 40 Thrive Podcast, the show created for women 40 and beyond, ready to shake things up. Get exclusive access to expert advice, support, and strategies that will inspire, motivate, and give you the tools to not just survive, but thrive. And now, your host, Jackie McDougall.
Welcome to the 40 Thrive Podcast. This week's episode is a good one. I've got Lori Gottlieb here. She's a psychotherapist and a New York Times bestselling author who writes the weekly Dear Therapist advice column for The Atlantic. She's written hundreds of articles related to psychology and culture, many of which have been viral sensations all over the world. A contributing editor for The Atlantic, she also writes for the New York Times and appears as a frequent expert on relationships, parenting, and hot-button mental health topics in the media such as The Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, Dr. Phil, CNN, NPR. You get it, a lot of places. Her latest book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, a therapist, her therapist, and Our Lives Revealed, just debuted at number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. The new book is being talked about by everyone from People magazine to Oprah, the New York Times to the 40 Thrive podcast. So after you finish listening to this episode, make sure that you go to the show notes and you buy the book. But if you're an audiobook fan, you can actually get Maybe You Should Talk to Someone for free with an Audible trial. Just head on over to audibletrial.com/40thrive and you get a free month of Audible along with a free audio download. So what a great reason to head on over and do that. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation that I had with Lori Gottlieb. Lori, welcome to the 40 Thrive podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you are blowing up, my friend. You are everywhere. How are you feeling? Let's get to the good stuff first.
Oh yeah, that is the good stuff. It's really surprising and remarkable. When you write a book, you have no idea if anybody other than your family members are going to read it.
And even then, it's a crapshoot. Exactly.
Exactly. It's like, wait, why is that on the bottom of your pile on the nightstand? Yeah, I'm really thrilled with the response. I wrote the book for a reason, which was that I wanted to open up these conversations about our emotional health. And I think that the more people who read this and start talking about it, the more it starts normalizing these conversations. So I'm thrilled with the response.
Right. Well, I have to tell you, I think that one of the reasons it's doing well, definitely to open up those conversations, but the fact that you open up the conversation, not just about your experience as a therapist, but your experience in therapy, that's one of my favorite things. If anyone who has ever listened to this podcast, when I have experts on who are willing to be human first. And I think people are really responding to your willingness and, your ability to be a human first.
Yeah, that was really important to me in writing this book. Originally, I thought I wanted to bring people back into the therapy room with me as a clinician so that they could see what people really struggle with and how they get through those struggles and what they really talk about, because you don't see other people in therapy. But then I thought, I don't want to be the expert up on high. I want to show my humanity. And it almost felt fraudulent not to show my own experience in therapy that I was going through simultaneously.
Well, most therapists that I know would probably just live in that, oh yeah, I feel like a fraud, but I'm still going to just present myself as this expert. What do you think it was in you that was so willing to be vulnerable and put yourself out there in a way where people may not think, oh, she's this great therapist because you need one yourself?
Right. I think that that's really the dilemma that I grappled with. And I really felt in the end it was worth it, because I think that what people maybe don't realize is that our humanity is our greatest tool in helping them. And I think we're all more the same than we are different. And if I didn't show that, if I didn't sort of walk the walk, then I felt like there was sort of a whole dimension would be missing from the book. And it's funny because when I told people that I was writing this book, my friends would say things like, oh, that's really interesting. But my colleagues, my therapist colleagues would say, you're doing what? What are you doing? Let me get this straight.
That's funny because I think they are probably a little bit nervous that you're giving away, the secrets.
Actually, the response from them has been really wonderful. I think that we don't want to appear like wizards, right? We don't want to be these people who do these weird, things and tricks and whatever that people don't know about. I think that we want to really make therapy accessible, and we don't want people to not come to therapy because they don't really understand what it is, or they wonder what we're doing or thinking, or it feels mysterious or strange or weird. So I think when I explain very clearly in the book, here's what I'm thinking, here's why I'm doing it, here's what happens, here's how people behave, I think that makes it easier for people to come and talk to a therapist. So I don't think that my colleagues want to be the wizard. I think we definitely want to be very accessible. I just don't think that a lot of people want to be accessible by showing themselves in their own therapy.
Right. Do you think that there has been a shift in therapists? Before it was like they were the wizard, they were, perfectly healthy emotionally and all of that. And in some ways, I liken it to when you go to maybe a religious leader who maybe doesn't necessarily understand like marriage or parenting, or, so people used to go to therapy expecting that person has it all together. And now I think that there's something about going to therapy for somebody who's been there, who understands the struggles, who maybe has been through a divorce or is a single parent, or, it's so much easier to work with someone, I think, that understands where you're coming from when you're going through a struggle. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And yet I still think that there's kind of a disconnection between what people want and what they actually will do. Meaning, I talk about in the book a colleague who had been trying to get pregnant with her husband for a while, and she'd gone through all of these fertility nightmares, was finally pregnant, and she was standing in a Starbucks when she got a call from her doctor saying that the pregnancy wasn't viable, and she burst into tears. And one of her patients happened to walk in and saw the therapist sobbing like that, and made eye contact, immediately left, and never came back. So I think, and for me, obviously, I wouldn't want to see my therapist doing that in the room with me. But if I had walked into a Starbucks and seen that, I would trust her more, because I would feel safer with her knowing that she gets what it's like to be a person in the world. She's not a robot. She had a very human reaction to a very difficult situation. So I think that people want us to be human beings, but they don't necessarily want to know about it.
That's interesting. So take me back to when you were it sounds like things were moving along, and you were, you're a mom and you're a therapist and you're an author. And then what was going on when you decided to seek therapy?
So I was in a relationship with somebody that I thought I was going to marry. We had been talking about marriage for a while. And right as we sort of got closer to that, he disclosed that he had decided that he couldn't live with a kid under his roof for the next 10 years. And that kid was my 8-year-old. And he had kids too, but they were older and they were going to go to college soon. And he had been really struggling with this for a while, but never told me. And I had no idea. So he very much wanted, his story was he very much wanted to be with me. And that's why it took him so long to come to this place where he could tell me, because he didn't want to break up, but he just couldn't go through with it. And so I am completely blindsided by this. And I end up going to a therapist for what I think will be crisis management, sort of, to get over the shock of this, but mostly for validation, so that the therapist could say, yeah, that guy was a sociopath. How could he be living with this and talking about marriage this whole time and, never tell you this? But that's not what the therapist does, in fact.
Yeah, he kind of like told it to you straight, which I think ultimately is probably what you needed.
Right. It's very much what I needed. And it's interesting because in the book, I talk about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. And idiot compassion is what we do with our friends a lot, where we want to make them feel better. And so we take their side. We don't want to kind of rock the boat, even though our honesty would be more helpful than our kind of cheerleading. And wise compassion is what my therapist did. And wise compassion is what most therapists do, which is you hold up a mirror to the patient so that they can see a reflection of themselves and they can see something that they don't normally see. All of their blind spots, all of the ways that they're maybe shooting themselves in the foot and end up in the same place over and over because they're doing something that they're not aware of. And so my story that I came in with about my boyfriend was very much a story that I thought was very cut and dried. And my therapist, made me look at it from a different angle, which I did not like at first, by the way. I very much wanted to feel better in the moment as opposed to feeling better in the long term.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's probably why you, at least in the back of your mind, why you went to therapy, knowing that what it actually looks like. It's not like you were blindsided by therapy. You know what a good therapist would actually do versus somebody who's just going to be a cheerleader in your corner.
Right. You do and you don't. I think when it was my friend who's a therapist who actually told me that I should go see a therapist, because I didn't call a therapist right away. I actually waited a few weeks, and I was sort of not doing so well outside of work. In work, I was fine because I was able to focus and concentrate on something else. But outside of work, your whole routine has changed. You're used to talking to this person every day. You're used to being with them at night. Everything's different. That's the person that you would tell about the minutia of your day, and that person's not there anymore. And so I was like, I left my credit card at Target, and I tripped on a step in my garage, and I was sort of a mess. And so finally, my friend said, you need to go talk to someone. You need to go somewhere where you're not being a therapist, but you can't help kind of both being a therapist and not being a therapist if you're a therapist in therapy. So on the one hand, I very much acted like a patient, which was I expected him to validate what I was saying. And also, I wanted him to like me. And when I would see another patient in the waiting room, when I was leaving, I wanted him to like me more. I wondered, if her sessions were more interesting than mine, all the things that we do when we go to therapy. But on the other hand, I was a therapist, and I was also sometimes I would sort of backseat drive. I would wonder, I don't know if I would do it that way, or I don't know if I would say that. So it was an interesting dynamic that went on.
Yeah. And do you feel like you sort of had the ability to manipulate the situation knowing, I mean, I've been in therapy. I'm not currently in therapy, but in my life, different therapists at different times. And I'm kind of a master in manipulating. And I feel like I remember seeking and seeking and seeking to find somebody who would call me on my shit and who wouldn't just allow me to come in and talk about myself in this way. I mean, it was completely useless for me to not be called out. Did you go into it kind of thinking you could manipulate it?
I think what you're talking about is so normal. It's what, most of us, we want to, it's almost like there's a performative aspect to it, that we want to present the best part of ourselves because we want to be liked and we want to be respected. And we don't necessarily want to show the therapist all of the things that maybe we feel shame about. And I think that's why people keep secrets from their therapist and why I kept secrets from my therapist. So, I think there are the secrets that we keep from the world and the secrets that we keep from the people close to us. But there's also the secrets that we keep from our therapists. And then there are the secrets that we keep from ourselves. And it's those last two that we deal with most in therapy. What are the secrets that people are keeping from me? And what are the secrets that they're keeping from themselves that I don't know what the secret is, but I know that it's there. And you see that I follow these 4 very different patients throughout the book. I'm sort of the 5th patient in the book. And you can see that all of us have secrets. And it's very hard for us to acknowledge them to ourselves, much less to our therapist.
Absolutely. And I think that's what you completely nail, exactly what it is that we do when we're not able to kind of get over the hump, or we're not able to really truly heal from whatever it is we need to heal from, because we're pretending that, it's those self-imposed secrets, I think, that really kill us. So let's talk about your four characters for a second, because I want to focus on two of them. Because two of them are, one of them is you.
Yes.
And one of them is a woman who is about 69, 70 years old. And so do you see obviously this is a show for women over 40. Do you see common struggles that kind of appear after 40 that maybe weren't present or weren't acknowledged when we were younger?
I think we just weren't aware of them because they weren't part of the fabric of our lives when we were younger. So I think some of the problems I see for women over 40 that they come in with are, I think there's a lot of questioning about realizing that our time is limited, whereas I think when we're younger, we don't realize that in the same way. And there's just more of an awareness of, I really need to be intentional about how I want to live my life because half of it is over. And I think that really can be a very hopeful and liberating thing in addition to being scary, because it makes us examine our lives, but it also gives us a lot of freedom to try things that maybe we were going to put off for later, but now we know that later is already here. So I think that's one thing that I think goes on. I think another thing is that I think a lot of people, despite being surrounded by friends or family or children, feel isolated in their experience and also in their lives. That I think we don't make enough time for face-to-face connection with people who are meaningful to us. And so, yes, we're texting and we're on social media or we're, somehow in touch with our screens, but we don't really spend time with people the way that women of a different generation did. They had a much more connected social network of people that they would see regularly. And we're really missing out by not having that.
I could not agree more. I remember being a kid and, a mom would just pop in at another mom's house for a cup of Sanka,
Absolutely.
And now it's like, you have to text and when works and it's 3 weeks from Thursday and, and then, Johnny's sick or whatever it is. Like it's really hard sometimes to connect in this particular world right now as we're in it.
It is. And I think too, we don't have that mom community that's in real life in the same way. There are a lot of online virtual communities, which are great in lots of ways. But what you're saying about the dropping in, that kind of thing, we don't even call other people. That's, it feels intrusive. You're going to text them if you want to try to get together. You don't even sometimes call just to have a conversation.
That's so true. Sometimes the phone will ring and I'm like, oh my God, who died?
Right. Like, what's wrong?
Right. Exactly. So your book obviously stems from personal experience, not only as you're in therapy, but also as a therapist. But you've written a couple of books before. Did those books come from your own personal experience as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because those were written before I was a therapist. So it felt very different in terms of writing about myself, because it's one thing to write memoir when you're a writer, and it's another to do it when you have a practice full of people who may be reading it. I never stopped writing when I became a therapist. So I write the weekly Dear Therapist column for The Atlantic, and I write for the New York Times, and, I write a lot, but not so personally anymore. And this was the kind of thing where when I was writing it, I really was very raw and open and honest about what was going on. And it turns out, as you read the book, you see that, it's not really about the boyfriend. It ends up being about all these other issues in my life that I think a lot of women will relate to in terms of questions about their careers or their health or, their relationships in different ways. But I think that what ended up happening was I turned in the draft to my editor, and all of a sudden I wanted to kind of make it prettier. I wanted to, I got very self-conscious, and I realized that I couldn't do that. I was either going to have to write about myself in an honest way or not do it at all.
Right. And that makes perfect sense. And it's fascinating though to see, I used to blog and I think we met a million years ago because we at a website. So back then it was like the whole mommy blogging thing. And I'm grateful that most of those websites are gone, because sometimes I'll read something I wrote a few years ago and think like, what an idiot. Like, what was wrong with you? So it's fascinating to me though, because as you said, you went into therapy thinking it was about the boyfriend, but I couldn't help but to go back to your last book, Marry Him, The Case for Settling for Mr. Good Enough. And I have to ask you, were you following kind of your instructions in that book and trying to make this guy like more than he was?
No, not at all. First of all, I think that what I mean by no is I think I'm talking about what you mean by the book, meaning the book has nothing to do with settling or lowering one's standards. It's a journalistic, researched book about what makes for happy, lasting marriages, and it's the research of everything from psychologists to sociologists to people who study divorce, people who study marriage, behavioral economists, historians. But I lost that title battle with the publisher. And I'm sort of known for as being the settling person when that is not my philosophy whatsoever. It's not my philosophy in my life or in the lives of people I care about. And it's not the philosophy I would, recommend to people who come to see me for therapy. So, I think that what the book talks about is about having actually higher standards, but about the things that matter, which is kindness and generosity and what do you have in common, and do you have similar values, those kinds of things. But you have to be in love with the person and you have to be attracted to the person.
That makes perfect sense. And honestly, there are two lessons from this. Number one being people don't understand what happens when an author writes a book and all of these struggles and in titles and direction and marketing and all that good stuff. So it's a little bit of a behind the scenes, pull back the curtain. But the other thing too is like, I have not read that book. So that was on me by asking that question based on a blurb versus actually digging into the book and finding out really what it's about. So I think that's one of the things that we tend to do. And I'm calling myself out right now because we tend to do that. We see something online, we see something in a description, and everything out there is marketing, right? And so I see that and I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. So I'm curious if she settled. But in fact, that's not what that book is about at all.
No, it's not. It's no, but you've done what a lot of people do. So don't feel bad about it, because I think that's what happens is people do see something and things are moving so quickly and they don't really they imagine they know what something is about. And that was why I really wanted that title not to be that title. I knew that that's what would happen, is that I would be associated with settling, which is, who would come to me for therapy? Can you imagine people coming in? Oh, I'm going to go to the settling therapist. No, I would have nobody in my practice if that's what I espoused.
Right. That is so true. But, there was something in it, though, that really spoke to me, because I know marketing. I come from this TV background. I know what sells books. But at the same time, I was reading a little bit about it. And, you were talking about a man being an 8 and not waiting for the 10. Or, I think sometimes we have this idea in our heads of what is best for us and who is best for us and what we're waiting for. And in actuality, I mean, I've been married for 16 years. I would have never imagined my husband being my husband. He did not fit the suit that I had imagined in my head. And he's the best human in the world for me. And so I do love that that's kind of part of your messaging.
Well, right. I think that what my messaging is that I think we don't take the time to get to know people. And we have a very rigid idea in our head of who the guy's going to be, right? And so what happens is we rule out people very quickly, and we rule in people who are not good for us. So there's a woman in the book, in fact, who's in her 20s, one of the patients that I write about, and maybe you should talk to someone. And she keeps hooking up with the wrong guys, and she can't see her role in that. She can't see that, when she does encounter men who would be good for her, who are, by the way, lovely men who are attractive and interesting. But I think sometimes we are stuck in patterns that we aren't aware of. And it takes a while for people to, go through enough bad experiences to realize that they need to do something different if they want to be happy.
Yeah, there was a part of me that was wondering if you followed me around in the 90s and wrote that about me.
Well, I think a lot of people saw themselves in that.
I'm sure. And that's the thing is you can see yourself, a little bit of yourself in every one of those characters because you make the point that what we're struggling with is universal.
Exactly. And I think that people don't talk enough about that. And so what I was trying to do in this book was really bring people right into the room with me so they can here's reality. This is not Facebook. This is not Instagram. This is not what we talk about in maybe public, but it's what we're all going through. And why do we have to feel like we're alone in it?
Right. What do you feel that you have learned about yourself by getting back into therapy?
I think we go to therapy at different times in our lives. So who I was at 20 is different from who I am now. And I think our struggles are different. Our perspective is very different. We've lived more life. We have more things have happened in our lives, both good and painful. In lots of ways, life gets better as you get older. And in some ways it gets more restrictive. So I think that there are different things that you talk about at different times. And I think I came at this time when I was really struggling with midlife and really struggling with here's where my life is and what do I do with the time that I have left? How do I make sure that I'm not wasting it? I think there's this great expression that came about during my therapy, which was something like, time is the coin of life, spend it well. I'm probably misquoting that. But I love that idea that you get this one coin and you want to spend it well. And I think that one of the gifts of midlife is that you're very aware of the worth of that coin.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I know the 40 Thrive listeners and the 40 Thrive community will really get out of this book is that you go to therapy because of this breakup, but you really were going through so many things that the rest of us can really relate to. And to see you go through this journey is, I think it gives everybody that ability to connect and have a little bit of hope, Yeah,
I think it's a very hopeful book. And that's the response that I've been getting so far. It's been out a week, and that's the response I've been getting so far, is that it's really hopeful and inspiring. And so even in the painful parts, there's something about growth and change and how we come out the other side. And I think that as you get older, it gets easier to get through painful periods. It gets easier to look at yourself more realistically. It gets easier to kind of navigate in the world. And it gets easier to change your patterns because after doing it for so long, a lot of people feel like, okay, I'm ready. There's this great therapist joke. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 1, if the light bulb is ready to change. And I think that women in midlife are very ready to change.
Absolutely. I think that back when I was in my 20s, I would have behavior and then look back at that behavior and kind of beat myself up. And then maybe in my 30s, it was like, I would discover I was in the middle of the behavior. I'm like, oh, I'm doing that thing. And then in my 40s, I can actually stop myself and go, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's way too exhausting and it's just not working for my life. And so it's this ability to kind of stop and really assess the situation and not go down that rabbit hole of angst and anxiety and frustration because it's just not worth it.
Exactly. And I think the other thing that happens in midlife is that we've spent a lot of time being really unkind to ourselves. And I write a lot in the book about this notion of, at one point, my therapist says to me, I want you to listen to the voice in your head and how unkind you can be to yourself. And I think when we really listen, if you were to write it down, you'd be mortified. You would never talk to a friend or a family member or a child or someone that you care about that way. And I think that women especially can be so hard on themselves. And if they really listen to, like if they make a mistake, they kind of self-flagellate for something so minor. And so one thing that's come out of the therapy from the book is I've become much kinder to myself. And when we're kinder to ourselves and more compassionate with ourselves, we're also more compassionate with other people. And there's a difference, by the way, between, I think some people are worried about being too kind to themselves because then they think, well, then I'm not going to be accountable for anything. But you can take responsibility for things that you want to change or things you want to do differently, but be kind to yourself in the process.
Yeah, that's great advice. So I have to ask you this question though, because I was reading that there are, I don't want to jack up the numbers, but there are many, many people who are suffering with their mental health. And yet the numbers, it's like a fraction of them who are actually seeking out therapy. And it really got me thinking, because we all know that there are plenty of people who are struggling and suffering in silence and they're not going to anyone. But what do you think of this whole side of, life coaching, people out there who are working with people in a way that could feel like therapy, but there's no regulation of it?
Right. So there are so many differences between life coaching and therapy. And there's such a wide range of life coaches because, again, they don't have a regulatory board. There's no licensing board. Anybody can hang up a shingle and call themselves a life coach. But I think that what happens is people feel a lot of stigma around going to therapy, and there's less stigma around calling up a life coach, the way you'd call up a personal trainer or something like that. So I think that sometimes people who are afraid to go to therapy, or they feel that there's some stigma around that, would much more easily call up a life coach. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that our emotional health is really important. It's not an accessory. It's not like, something that you do like going to yoga. It's which yoga is important too, I guess. But I think that our physical health and our emotional health are not so different. And so I think if people, for example, are feeling chest pain, they're going to go get that checked out before they have a massive coronary. But if someone feels sad or anxious or, something feels off emotionally, it takes a lot sometimes for people to call up a therapist, and they don't really land in our offices until they're having the equivalent of an emotional heart attack. And then it's harder to treat. And then you've also suffered for a while when you didn't need to. So I think that it's great that there are different places that people can go. They can go to a life coach, but it's something very different from what we do as therapists. And I hope that the more that we kind of open up about our emotional health, that people, if they need a life coach and that works for them, I'm all for it. But I also feel like people shouldn't be afraid of going to a therapist. They shouldn't feel that there's any kind of stigma around doing that.
Definitely. And what would be the first step? What would you recommend if someone's listening right now and thinks, I could really use a therapist? What should she do?
The most important thing in terms of the success of your therapy, how well it's going to go, isn't the therapist's training or years of experience or what modality they use, but it's really the relationship that you have with your therapist. Study after study shows this. And so I think that look around on Psychology Today or on your health plan and Google around and see who looks like a good fit for you on the screen. And then go in for a consultation. Most therapists today, including myself, the first session we set up as a consultation. So it's an opportunity for you to come in and we hear a little bit about what's going on with you, but you get the opportunity to see what it feels like being in the room with us. And that's the most important thing. And at the end of that session, you say to yourself, did I feel understood? Did this person feel easy to talk to? And if so, that's a person that you might want to go back and see. If that didn't happen, that might not be the right fit for you. So feel free to look for the therapist who is the best match for you. And we as therapists are not, it may feel awkward for you not to come back, if you've gone to a first session, but we understand that. We want to get you to the right place, and not every patient and every therapist are going to be the right match. So it's worth it to make sure that you're going to someone that you really feel good about.
Right. And you probably, I can only imagine, if they don't feel like you're right for them, they may not feel like a great fit for you.
Yeah, that sometimes happens, and in which case I would refer them to someone who is. But that doesn't happen as much. I think all of us work with a wide variety of people, and it's rare that happens unless they're dealing with something that I feel like somebody else has a specific expertise in that I would want them to see. But yes, I would absolutely refer if for whatever reason it wasn't the right match.
Right. That's great. So I have to ask, the boyfriend, the breakup, all of that, does he know, has he read the book?
I don't know. I don't know if he's read the book, but the thing about the boyfriend was, I think that I wanted to tell the story the way that it actually happened, which is that in the beginning, I want readers on my side. I want them to say, yeah, he's a jerk, right? But then what they come to see is that he's really not a jerk. And I really had a role in this too. And whatever he was avoiding, I had my own ways of avoiding things. And I wasn't so different from him. And I think that that's the beauty of therapy. And I want readers to sort of go along on that journey, because I think they'll become much more sympathetic to him as they read along. And as my therapist points out, another way of looking at what happened between us. So I think that that's what's interesting about the boyfriend story, is that whether or not he's read it, he comes off very well ultimately. And that's the point.
Yeah, I think, even in the beginning of our conversation, I was like, and I ordered the book and I'm not through it. And I always like to try to finish it before. And you and I got on the phone, pretty quick turnaround. And so I'm like trying to push through. It's so good. But one of the things about him is that at first I was like, what an ass. It's not like you were hiding the kid.
Right.
But then I started to think about it, and, somebody who would go forward in a marriage feeling these things, I feel that would be the problem. I think somebody who really was in tune with what was aligned with his life and what he had been through and where he was going, as painful as it is, was the biggest gift you could have gotten.
Right. It was the right thing for both of us, but I couldn't see that at the time. And, even at the beginning of the book, I show both sides of him. And I talk about how when we are in love with someone, we often will talk about them through that lens. So I talk about all of his wonderful qualities that were true, that he really did have. He is a really good guy. And he was a great boyfriend. But then, when somebody hurts us or when the relationship ends, we tell the story through a different lens, which was the lens of, let me tell you the story about what happened that night when he decided all of a sudden he didn't want to be, with me because he couldn't live with a kid under his roof for the next 10 years. And so I hear that all the time. And when I see a lot of couples in my practice, and you'll see the difference between the story that they would tell when things are going well, and the story that they'll tell when things are not going well. And it's the same person. It's just that they choose to highlight different things about that person depending on how they feel at that time.
Right. It's funny. I always say that when you're in the beginning of a relationship and you're like, we finish each other's sentences, and it's all like cutesy. And then you're married after a while and you're like, he won't let me finish my own sentence.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think that idea of perspective is a big theme in the book, that, how can we see things through a perspective that will be more helpful to us than the narrow one that we often use.
Right. And my favorite thing, that the whole thing about perspective and personal responsibility, and we really are in charge of our own happiness, which happens to be, ironically, the book you were supposed to be writing about when everything.
Yes.
You were supposed to be writing about happiness.
Right. And I felt like I couldn't write that book. I was under contract to write that book. And I started calling it the stupid, miserable, depression-inducing happiness book, because I felt like I was starting out as a therapist then, and I felt like I was only scratching the surface of what I was actually seeing in the therapy room. And it felt inauthentic to me to be writing that book, because we aren't actually searching for happiness, as I write in this book, that we're searching for meaning and fulfillment and all of these things that lead to happiness, but we're not searching for happiness as the end goal. And I was sort of like, but I was so ashamed of the fact that I couldn't write this book. And so I would tell everybody, including my boyfriend at the time, I'm writing the book. I was almost like that closet gambler who gets dressed for work in the morning and kisses your partner goodbye and then goes to the casino instead of the office. But my casino was Facebook, or writing fabulous, witty emails to my boyfriend. And ultimately, that was one of the things that I was hiding even from my therapist. And I didn't tell him about the struggle with my book for a very long time. And at that point, he kind of said to me, well, you don't have to do this book. And I'm like, no, I do. I used all the money to pay for my internship, when I was training, and I can't return the money. And my agent says I'll never write another book. And he's like, well, did you get a second opinion? And I'm like, oh, you don't know anything about publishing. So it's funny how we can be so blind sometimes in our own lives when another person can see what we're doing so clearly.
That's so true. And that's when you need to seek, at the very least, a friend in person over coffee versus online, or, at the most, go and seek out a new therapist and be able to kind of work this stuff out. Because I think the self-discovery, the personal responsibility, all of that, I wouldn't necessarily say happiness, but I think that all leads to an inner joy that ultimately makes you happier.
Yeah, there's a kind of peace, but I think that we don't talk about some of these things like the book thing. I talk in the book about this concept of, I don't think there's a hierarchy of pain. And I felt like, I have a book contract. I can't really complain about that, right? # first world problems. But pain is pain. And at the time I was seeing this woman who was young and dying of cancer, and she was newly married. And I thought, really, how can I talk about a book contract when people have problems like that? And what I came to realize was that all of our pain is real because it's usually symptomatic of a deeper pattern or struggle that's going on. It's not about the book so much as it is about, I'm really worried about how much time I have left, and am I doing something meaningful with the time I have left? And, people come in and they say things like, well, my husband won't initiate sex with me, or the babysitter is stealing from me. And I don't think that's trivial at all, because this idea of your husband maybe not being in love with you or rejecting you is very painful. Or, the babysitter stealing from you is you trusted this person with the people who are most important to you in your life, and you've been betrayed. And what does that mean? So I think that all of our struggles are important because they're usually about something deeper and much more significant.
Absolutely. And I think that when we start to compare our struggles, if you break your arm and you're like, well, I didn't get it cut off, but it hurts to have a broken arm. So it's okay to acknowledge what we're going through might be painful without, trying to compare it with what somebody else might be going through.
It's true. And I think especially when I see women in my practice, often they'll apologize for crying about something. They'll be crying and they'll say, I'm sorry, as they're crying, as if there's something to apologize for being in pain. And there's not.
Especially in therapy. I mean, that would be the place to let it go,
Right.
Well, I'm just very excited about all of the success for you. I know that you're on the book tour, and people can go over to lorigottlieb.com to you can, first of all, get the book, and that's everywhere books are sold, I assume?
It is.
I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Amazon, but they can get it wherever. And I saw that you were recently in an airport and you saw your book right there, front and center.
I did. That was very exciting.
That is very exciting. I've noticed when I work with women over 40 and some of the life goals they set and achieve, that sometimes we downplay. Oh yeah, my book is like right there in the middle of the airport, the terminal that I walk through when I travel. And like the fact that you are able to go, this is freaking awesome, because I think that the more we celebrate all of the successes and all the great stuff, it gives also permission for other women to go, you know what? I nailed that presentation at work.
Right.
And so I just really applaud you. You're really killing it. And I'm excited for you.
Thank you. It's funny because when I was doing these on book tour, I've been doing a lot of events. And one of the things that comes up is this Eva Longoria has optioned this for television, and we're developing it for a series. And so many times when they would say that, I would say, oh, yeah. But what about this? I would sort of change the subject because I think it's hard sometimes to celebrate ourselves. And it's sort of like, we've worked hard for things. Why not? And that's one of the lessons I think of this book tour is why not? Why not be proud of ourselves? And there's nothing, I think men it's so much easier. And this is a gross generalization, but I think it's easier when I see male authors, and it's so much easier for them to acknowledge that all of this exciting stuff is happening. But I think for women, we still sort of downplay it. So I'm working really hard not to downplay it on this book tour.
That's great, because you are living as an example to others. And so the more that listen, I see your Facebook posts, and like, even when you mentioned that Eva Longoria optioned this, it was a very humble, there was not like oh my gosh, look at this, and so I know sometimes we try to kind of keep it close to the vest. So that way, maybe we don't get a reaction that we think we're all that, or whatever the reason. But I think the fact that you're out there, you're doing it, this book is going to help so many people. This isn't all about Lori Gottlieb. This is you using your gifts to help other people. And so of course it's going to be of course it's going to be a TV show, because this is what we need right now. And so I love that you are seeing all the success, because it comes from a place of service. You just happen to be the vehicle that service is coming through.
Yeah. And that's I think the thing that I think is most gratifying, is hearing people say, I saw myself in this person in the book, or I saw myself I saw somebody that I know or that I love in one of these patients that you write about, or in you. And I think that's the conversation that I hope that more people will start having, is we don't have to feel so alone. We are really similar in terms of our desires, our struggles, our questions about life. And I hope we'll start talking more about them.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to add all of the links, everything people need in the show notes, so they can buy the book, they can follow you on the book tour, they can do all the things and find you everywhere. But before we go, the one question I ask all of my guests, I have to ask you, what do you think it means to 40 Thrive?
That's a great question. Because I think it's a lot of what we've been talking about for the last little bit here. I think it means to be comfortable in your own skin. And I think that once you're comfortable in your own skin, that it opens up so many opportunities for you professionally, personally. And I think that it's funny that when we're younger, we're so worried about appearance in a certain way. And yet I think as we get older, we become more comfortable in our bodies. And even though we were maybe more, quote unquote, beautiful when we were younger, I think there's something about feeling so much more comfortable I'm so much more comfortable now with how I look than I was then. And I think it's because I'm so much more comfortable inside. I'm so much comfortable with my insides, and I'm so much more comfortable in my own skin. And I don't care about a lot of the things that felt so important when I was younger, that my priorities now are so different. And I think there's a freedom and a sense of peace that comes with that.
I love that. That's absolutely like the best definition ever. So thank you so much, Lori, for coming on the podcast. And I wish you all the continued success.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been so fun.
Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Or if you prefer listening online, head on over to 40thrive.com/podcast to hear all the episodes. And join us in our private 40 Thrive Facebook group and connect with other women also on a mission to thrive. I'll catch you next time. Keep thriving.